I was raised in a family, they were basically atheists. I mean, my mother and father never went to church, and just thought this was superstition. And however, and my father, I remember telling me when I was a child that his grandmother told him, in other words, my great-grandmother on the paternal side, told him that she didn't believe in God. And that made an impression on him. But he passed this on, so that was a long thing on that side. But my mother's mother, and I didn't know this until a few years ago, my mother's mother apparently had visions. She never went to church, but she had religious visions. And she kept journals of all these visions that she had. She had conversations with Mary and Jesus, I guess, according to my mother, who very reluctantly told me this story. And I said, well, Mom, what happened to these journals? You know, apparently she had this stack of journals. And my mother said, oh, well, when she died, her sister and she burned them. And I said, why? I mean, surely they wouldn't have taken up much room. And she said, oh, well, we just didn't want anybody to have to deal with it. So you can see that this, in my family, anything spiritual or of this nature is a real taboo, to the point, I mean, the Inquisition isn't over. You know, the book burning goes on. So, but there is that link, in spite of the fact that I wasn't very especially close to my grandmother. I mean, I didn't see her that much, and there wasn't that much relationship. But just before she died, I was in Italy for the first time, and I knew that she was involved with religious things, and I loved St. Francis, and I sent her this little poem, you know, Sister, how does it go? You probably know, Johnny, that Sister Water and Brother, you know, and I sent it to her in Italian. I translated it into English, and I know she got it, and then she died. So there was that little connection. And when I was in Italy that first time is the first time I was really exposed to images of the Madonna and Child. And the first strong images I was exposed to were ones in Siena, which is the Sienese primitive art, and the Madonnas are all quite dark. And I remember asking, I mean, I was very drawn to these images, and still am. I love the Sienese primitive art. And I remember asking the professor, well, why are they so dark? And nobody had a good explanation for this. They just, well, you know, they're old paintings, but it you know, and I thought at the time that my response, because I was an art major, was aesthetic. I mean, I thought my interest was because these were so beautiful, which they are. But, you know, I think I was drawn in another way. And then during that year, which I was studying in Florence, I actually bought one painting, which was a modern painting done by a Florentine, but it was of a quite dark woman, nude, pregnant. And I think a lot of people that looked at this painting thought, well, boy, that's a really ugly painting, you know. And but there was something I really liked about it. It was sort of a major thing to do. I mean, it was like $100, which seemed like an incredible fortune. I brought this thing home. Interestingly enough, my mother could relate to that. She liked it too. She could relate on a visual level. So anyway, that's probably the first goddess figure. And the next goddess figure that I got involved with was, I went to Mexico when I was 22 and with a couple of friends. And I ended up, we love these pre-Columbian things, sculptures. And I ended up, we went to Mexico City to a place where they supposedly sold pre-Columbian objects, but most of them were fakes, you know. And we knew they were fakes, but we wanted a couple of fakes because they were so wonderful. So we went into this place, and it was a private home in Mexico City, and it was totally anonymous on the street. We were given the address by someone, you know. Inside there were rooms and rooms of these things, but no one was there quite when we got there. So we went inside and just kind of stood there, and I kind of wandered into a side room, and I saw this extraordinary little figure rather wide, little tiny breasts, and this great big sort of rounded nose that went like that, and with this tremendous sense of humor and wonderful quality about her. And then the people arrived that were supposed to sell us stuff, and they quickly whisked us upstairs, and we looked at all these different things, and I said, and my friends picked out some things to buy, and I said, but the one I like is downstairs, and you know, and he couldn't say, well, the ones that your friends bought are fakes and that one isn't, or whatever, I don't know. So he did sell me this little figure, and I just loved it. I did a couple of drawings of it and so on, and I took it back to California. And in fact, we had collected all these rocks that we thought, from sort of pyramid sites, that we thought were full of wonder and spirit, and they probably were, I don't know, but I mean, then in another point of view that was sort of like a bunch of rubble. But we had this tiny Volkswagen bus, this tiny little bug, you know, and there were 3 of us, and we had all our stuff and everything, and we accumulated all this stuff. So how could we take these precious rocks back home with us? So we thought, well, we could put them on top of the car, but in Mexico, as soon as you stop the car, that whatever's on top will be gone. So we thought about how we could transport these things without them being stolen. So we bought one of those beautiful baby coffins. It's painted all around with these gay little things, a little white baby, and we put it on top of the car and put all these precious rocks. And then we covered that over with a tarpaulin so that anybody peeking under there, you see. And of course, here were these 3 girls. And we drove this thing.
Because you were black. That's so genius.
And we drove this thing back over the border. So I got to California and arrived for the first time in San Francisco, and we set up, these friends and I set up these little objects, including mine and theirs and so on. And one friend, whom I really consider to be the first hippie in the world, she was Scottish, who had traveled with us, made friends with a bunch of people, but also with these young guys who were running a gallery called the International Gallery on Grant Avenue in San Francisco. And everything was called international in those days, and it would seem like it was a real positive thing. And unbeknownst to me, when I wasn't home, she loaned them all of these objects, including mine, to put in, because they had nothing in their window at the moment. That was the excuse. And so I was uncomfortable with that, but I didn't have the kind of guts to go claim this object. But I walked up and down the street and I saw it in the window, so that was comforting. There it was, in the window of this international gallery. And then I was engaged to this fellow that I shouldn't have been engaged to, and my plan was to give him this goddess figure as an engagement present, or as a wedding present, I suppose. Well, that was inappropriate. And it was very inappropriate that this thing was in this gallery. And I finally realized that it shouldn't be in this gallery. And I went to get it. And this fellow they were really sleazy, these guys. And they said, well, now, we really have nothing. We're going to have a show in 3 days. You must leave it just for these 3 days. And then, I was all conflicted. And then this guy sort of tried to make a pass at me, in a very sleazy way. And instead of doing what instinctually would be correct, which is to grab the thing and run out of there, right? I didn't. I didn't have that enough power at the moment to handle this situation as it needed to be handled. So just a few days later, I went by and the whole thing was gone, closed up. I called up, and the number had been changed. The people had left town. They had split. The whole thing was gone. And even at the time, I realized that at some level, I really understood that that this had been my goddess, and I had not had the strength to be worthy of her, and that also that it was inappropriate that I intended to give her away in the first place. Oh, and then there was this story. I finally did get this guy on the telephone. He said, oh, well, she broke, she fell from, you know, and of course it wasn't true. And then he was unreachable. I mean, they just were gone. These people were gone. But I did know, even then, that what was going on. And of course, then I broke the engagement and the whole, so that was my first really strong experience with the little goddess figure. The next strong goddess image was when my husband and I went back to Italy. By this time I was about 29. We were staying in a place, and an American came and he persuaded us to take this journey. He absolutely insisted, and we had just taken a trip and we didn't even want to go. He was a filmmaker, by the way. But he insisted, and so we did go. And on that trip he stopped he had discovered this man who was a stonemason who had had some kind of heart trouble, and he couldn't continue working. So he began doing his own sculptures just for fun, quote, in his garden. And his garden was inhabited, I just cannot tell you, it was inhabited with these gods and goddesses and these wonderful creatures. I mean, it was just incredible. And his wife and mother, I mean his wife and daughter rather, were there when we got there, and they just made fun of him. They just thought he was crazy. And he was this extraordinary artist, really in touch with this wonderful stuff of the earth. And so we fell in love with these things, and my husband, who's an artist, you know, was really excited about it too. And we bought this little goddess figure in stone, and I found myself, and we took it back to where we were living, which was outside of Siena in the country, and I put it in the window with this bucolic vineyards and so on behind it, and I really had a little place of worship with that. But I didn't completely understand what I was doing, but I knew that this was extraordinary. So we took that back to the United States when we left a year later, and then and we had that in our house and so on. And I'm trying to think the sequence of things. We went back to Italy when I was about, oh, I don't know, 34 or something, and that's when I became pregnant, and so then I played the Madonna myself. And having a child in Italy was an extraordinary experience, because people would come up and touch my belly, you know. They really considered this as extraordinary, and as and so that becoming a mother in Italy was like having an experience of being the Madonna to a certain extent, because they do regard each new birth with tremendous as a holy and sacred event, and so that was wonderful. That was really wonderful. Having a baby there was really wonderful, and then the joy with which the child was. I mean, everybody would come up, even long, you know, teenage boys would come up and be in relationship with the baby. It was really, that part of it was. So you see that Madonna and child that's so prevalent in Italy is still intact in the people. You know, the natural response to a new child in the world. So I guess I didn't need an external Madonna at that point in my life. But then we went back to California, and there was a period of a little bit of neglect in which this statue that I had of Roberto's, we had it out we put it sort of in the garden, and I wasn't involved with where it was placed. I didn't really think it was a good spot, but my husband put it in a certain place, and I had children's art classes, and the kids were running. One kid ran through and knocked it over, and it broke in half. It just split. So we put it upstairs in the storeroom and did nothing with it for a while. So that was this kind of dormant period or something. And then, trying to think where it goes from here. When I was 40 or so, I began meditating, and there was a kind of guide with me, an imaginary guide in my meditations, who still is there as a presence. And it was a Native American woman, older woman. And I don't know, somehow we put this statue back together, glued it together, and put it at the end of the pond. And I think all during this period I was very aware of a strong attachment with trees, particularly this one tree, which is a persimmon tree, but I won't go into that. But I'm trying to think how then I already knew I was interested in Black Madonnas. And Ian Begg, I went to a number of Jungian, I was quite involved with Jungian things, and went into Jungian therapy for a year at age, I guess 41, something like that. And the Jung Institute was sponsoring a lecture by Ian Begg in 1982 on Black Madonnas. So I went, and it was a rather dry lecture, but I got very excited about it. And I was with a friend, and I said, you know, this has always interested me. I mean, I don't even quite know how I knew it was a Black Madonna previously, but, you know, I said, this has always interested me. They're all over Italy. And my friend said, well, you ought to go around and really do a story and really select them. And I thought, well, I should, you know. But although I returned to Italy, I didn't, even though this spark was definitely there. Then in 1987, I was doing oral history with the people in this little village that well, that's a whole other story, but we bought, when our daughter was born, we bought during that time, we bought what was basically a ruin. I mean, it was just this, hadn't been lived in since the Second World War. It had dirt floors, and you were supposed to get the key to the door to a house in Italy when you paid for it, but there wasn't any key because the door was just this wooden thing that was, but it was a 3-story stone structure. And so, you know, over the years, we put a bathroom in and fixed it up, so on. And so I was doing oral history with the people in this village because they were right on the front during the Second World War. So I had started hearing all these extraordinary stories, and finally, after a number of years, I realized that this story had to be told. So I started doing oral history with the people. And in doing that, we talked a lot about the old ways and what life was like just before the Second World War. And it came out that there had been a Black Madonna. Now, previous to the Madonna that was there. But actually, just prior to the time when I found this out, I wrote a long piece about this procession that took place in this village every 4 years to Santa Maria del Carmine. And this is another coincidence, which is that 4 years after my daughter was born, we were in this village, and they had this big festival, and it was on my daughter's birthday. So I realized that this procession, Santa Maria del Carmine procession, had taken place on the day that my daughter was born, which was also as a full moon day. And so naturally, I was moved by this, and so I was very anxious for the next time when the procession was to take place, because it took place every 4 years. So it didn't take place, though, in 4 years, because the priest couldn't do it or something. But it did take place when my daughter was 9, and she and I went in this procession together through the town. And I used it as a way of writing about the people in the village as we went through the procession. And there was a very moving thing where the oldest woman in the village who hadn't been on the procession was at the end sitting in her doorway, and it was kind of a focal point. But anyway, I wrote this piece about this. Then, shortly thereafter, discovered that the original Madonna, the one they were carrying in this procession, was quite charming, but very, sort of saccharine and sweet. No real artistic value, but sort of charming. And so when I found out that there had been a Black Madonna, of course, I was really sparked by this. And I discovered that what had happened was that in the 30s, the Pope had a decree where he they were supposed to do away. I think this is a period when a lot of these black Madonnas were lost. But certainly in this village, I guess it was they were worried about idolatry. But what they told the peasant people, what they told the women, was that they were going to replace the statue with a more permanent one. The women had remembered dressing this black Madonna, and when someone recovered from an illness, they would give her necklaces and so on. And so they had to remove, she had to be taken out of the church and was replaced by this new statue, you see. The person who saved this Madonna was a man that I had tremendous respect for. He was a muratore too, stonemason, which is, I think, a very spiritual profession. But he was an extraordinary man. He was a fellow who had been taken prisoner of war in Russia during the war, and he escaped and walked home in winter. Now, obviously, he got some rides along the way, but I mean, this is major stuff. And he was a retired stonemason by the time we were in this village, but we needed a lot of work done on this house, and he was the one who did the work. And he had this extraordinary quality. I mean, he was a real artist. He would, you know, we would tell him, well, we think we want such and such, and he'd say, well, how about, and he would do it in the most gentle way. He said, well, you know, there's a possibility that you could do this. And we'd listen, and he was always right. And he was, you know, he was just extraordinary. And there was a rapport between him and myself, and also with my husband. He was very special. But unfortunately, he died before I interviewed him. And so he had saved, which he was the perfect person, had saved this black Madonna. It was in his house. But when he died, the house went to his son, who had immigrated to Scotland and who had none of the sensibilities of his father, and who had married a Scottish woman. And so that is currently where this black Madonna is. Now, in 1989, I knew this. And so when these Scottish people came to visit for their holiday, and I mean, I was just practically grabbing them and saying, listen, I really need to see this black Madonna. So one day they brought her to the garden, to our garden, and it was the most extraordinary thing, and all these strange people that should just happen by at that moment. I mean, it was, so I wrote about that too. Apparently she used to be, and all that's left now is really her head. But there used to be more of her, and somebody had thought, one of the village women told me that she'd been cut in half, and that seemed really strange. But when my husband looked at the actual statue, he could see, he said, well, the statue was made in two pieces. It was sculpted, it's wood. It was made in two pieces, and it just came apart. So that it's her head that's left, and it's very, very moving. It really is. And, you know, I've meditated a bit with her image, and it's her message to me is that one of remembering the sacredness in every moment, in the everyday. But anyway, so now is a problem of how to have the villagers reclaim their own heritage and help them see the value in this. I had talked to one woman about this and about the importance of the meaning of the black Madonna, and she was together in my kitchen, not when this statue was there, with a woman next door whom I had talked to for hours and hours about the Second World War, an older woman who had been through it, and who had even told me about her experiences with the black Madonna. And we were in the kitchen, and I was trying to explain more, and I had some books with pictures, and there was a young woman there of about 23 who said, well, this one, the black one, this one's ugly, isn't it? And I said, well, it has a meaning which is very, very beautiful. So we began talking about it, and she got very interested and so on. And the neighbor, whose name is Pina, whom I thought would really respond to this, started her voice, she raised her voice, and she started, as soon as I would speak, she would start talking about this masculine saint that had been found in some church, and her voice would be louder and louder. In other words, this was difficult material for her. I think it's because the Black Madonna had had so much power to her, and she had had to give it up. And along with giving it up were certain superstitions that she now felt embarrassed about. So it's a touchy subject. I've planted the seed with a couple of women in the village about the deep meaning of this Black Madonna and how people elsewhere have gotten excited. So it's already, the seed is there a little bit. And it's a very small village. We're not talking about having to influence very many people. Through all this business about the getting involved with studying Ian Begg's book and all these books and so on, there were a couple of extraordinary coincidences that happened. I was really involved with Ian Begg's book, and I was in this yoga class, and it was announced that China Galen, who was also in the yoga class, was doing a reading. And you know what the title of the book, of that book is, Longing for Darkness, Tara and the Black Madonna. So naturally I went right away to that lecture, and so there was the connection with China. And then I was trying to get a grant about the Second World War story in Sommocolonia, and got in touch with this Italian scholar and over the telephone, and she was very responsive, and she said, well, actually right now I'm doing something on religious folklore. And I said, well, I'm really interested in that. This is just over the phone. I've never met this woman. And she said, well, it's to do with the Black Madonna. And I just couldn't believe it. I simply couldn't believe it. And of course it was Lucia. And so then Lucia loaned me part of her manuscript, which wasn't finished at the time. And at the yoga class, I told China about Lucia, and then so they got together quite separately. Then I was sitting in the cafe reading Lucia's manuscript, and these two fellows started having this conversation about books, and it was sort of interrupting. I couldn't read, and there was a fellow meditating in the back who looked a little crazy, to tell you the truth. And he wasn't saying a word. He was just sitting in a chair meditating. And this was going on, and I was having trouble concentrating because these people were talking about books. And out of the blue, this guy who's sitting there, he hadn't said anything before, and anything. He said, you must read George Sandwith's book on the Black Madonna. And I'm going, I couldn't believe it. So all these things kept happening, these sort of intertwining things. And so I have pursued it. And then we went to Italy. The next time I went on I didn't know I was going to do this, so I wanted to go on this trip to southern Italy, and I didn't have Lucia's material with me at all, so I called her up, and she faxed me, which was the first fax I ever received, was this list of Black Madonnas in southern Italy, in Puglia. So I went down, we went on this trip, and I had some strong experiences seeing some Black Madonnas in Puglia. And I mean, I don't quite know what I'm doing with this. I mean, I really don't. I mean, the other day out here in Santa Fe, I keep getting lost. And I went into this gas station, and there was this very nice fellow, Latino guy, and I was in a hurry. I was trying to get to that Haitian dance program, and I was late. But he was engaged in talking to a woman who was on crutches, and was obviously, and I listened a little bit to what he was saying, and he was giving her this, he was very sweet, and he was saying, I've had a hard time too, and I had to rethink my life. I went to a therapist, and I've changed my life, and I had to go back to school, and that's hard at age 50, but he was giving her this wonderful advice, and saying now the physical therapy will really help, and all this stuff. So I sort of waited, and so then I was trying to desperately look for the dress, which I didn't have, and Margaret's dress, and I opened the Black Madonna stuff up, and they're kind of duplicated material, but not done very well, the black images. And he looked at that, and he looked and he said, that looks like crazy stuff. And I kind of looked too, and I thought, yeah, it does, doesn't it? It does look like crazy stuff. But, you know, here I am involved in it. So that was really funny. But it was a kind of, you know, reminder of my skeptical side, which is there. And yet, you know, I go see these Madonnas, and I always have these extraordinary times. You know, each one seems to have a sort of different message. So, I mean, the one in Manfredonia is, it was extraordinary coming upon her, and I've been writing a whole thing about that. And then the one in Siena, which all the time that I had spent in Siena, I didn't really, I think that the leader of the group when I was a student in Siena took us to see it and said, well, now this is a popular phenomena, sort of, you know. But I went back to see her, and I went in and sort of said, well, I felt very badly because I had forgotten to take a leaf, which is what I often do. And I went in and I said, well, you know, I didn't bring what I was meant to bring. And the only message I got back from her, and it was immediate, was, you don't need to bring anything but a pure heart. Each of the Black Madonnas I've seen seemed to say something particular. The one in Manfredonia was a little more complex, but it was that she was a full woman. I don't know how to even express it. The womanliness of her seemed very full and complete. You sensed that there was this tremendous sorrow and grief that she had experienced, but that she was, just from this expression, that extraordinary painting, really a powerful painting, that she was also very responsive to the joy of a child and the newness and of discovery and so on. And the one in Lucca, there was a sense of the tremendous power of the feminine, you know. You just got a message of sheer power. But one that I'm writing about now, as I've been sort of rewriting, going over some of those experiences, is one, it's the Madonna delle Sette Vele, and it's in Foggia, which is down on the Gargano Peninsula, very southern Italy. And Foggia is not an interesting town. It's a sort of modern industrial, well, I don't know that it's industrial, but it's really not very pretty. It probably was bombed, I suppose, during the war. But anyway, my husband and I, were only planning to be there briefly. He had a certain tolerance for this Black Madonna stuff, but he, you know, didn't want to stick around Foggia too long, and I couldn't really blame him. So we didn't have long, and we raced to the cathedral, and we couldn't find the Madonna, the Black Madonna in there. And I knew there was one from Lucia's list, but I went all around the cathedral, and we couldn't find her. There was a mass going on to the right of the apse, and we looked all around. To the left of the apse was the most gory, repulsive, I would say, crucifixion I've ever seen, where it was very physically spelled out. This isn't usually true in Italy. Sometimes you see this in Germany, where, you know, this looked like a corpse. It really did. You know, this color and it was really a gory, physical representation of Christ. All right, but we looked all over, and we still didn't, you know, we couldn't find this Black Madonna. And so finally I asked a woman who was sitting in the central part of the church and kind of looking at us, if there wasn't a special Madonna there. So you have to kind of watch using the word black. And she said, oh yes, La Madonna delle Sette Vele. And she kind of pointed over to where this mass was going on, and I went back over and took another look. And here was this huge, oh, I'm sorry. There was a big gold frame above where the priest was saying the Mass. And he had on, by the way, this white robe with this gorgeous green, sort of bright green pattern on it. And inside this gold frame was virtually nothing, it seemed. It was just white material with a gold thread running through it. But as I looked closer, I realized that 3/4 of the way up, this empty picture was a black oval. That's all, just a black oval floating in this field of white silk, I assume. So I said to Bill, I think that's where she is. La Madonna delle Sette Vele means the Madonna of the 7 veils. So she was behind her veils. Okay? So we said, well, Bill said, well, maybe you can get the priest to show you the Madonna when the Mass is over. So we went out and had some breakfast and came back just as the Mass was finishing. And it was a very moving Mass. I mean, it was women, mostly women, not all, but of all different ages. They weren't all older women. They were young, and it was, I could see there was tremendous involvement. And at the end of the Mass, I saw he did something I've never seen before. He swept down and practically touched as in a bow, practically kissed the earth in front of this blank picture. And then he disappeared. And I ran to try to catch him, but I couldn't find him. And so I asked this guard. It struck me as very strange that there was a guard in the church, you know, in uniform, but there was. And so I asked him where the priest had gone, and so he led me down some corridors to where to the priest's, I don't know what you call it, vestment room or whatever. He was changing his robe. So I was a little shy because he was taking this robe off, and from the doorway I said, you know, that I had traveled a long way, and he said, I can't hear you, come closer. So I went up to where he was standing, and he said, I told him that I had traveled a long distance and that I would really like to see this Madonna delle Sette Vele. And he had a very intelligent face. He had glasses, and he was rather tall. He was a very intelligent-looking fellow. And he turned to me, and he said, Signora, you go back into the church and to the right of the altar, and just look. You will see her there. And then he turned around, and that was all he had to say. And I went into the hallway, and I started walking down the hall, and then I just burst out laughing because he was talking about the ultimate mystery and the fact that they had all celebrated this thing, which they all knew was there, that they could see. So, and I suppose, and then on a very personal level, as I've reflected on this, later I've realized that it has particular meaning for me. I mean, I think it all has to do with the parts of ourselves that are unaccepted and the repressed parts. And there is a whole story, which I won't go into now, of a part of myself that was repressed and that was veiled. And so therefore it needs further explanation, you know, exploration into the depths of the mystery and bringing forth what was unacceptable or what is unacceptable about ourselves. And that's what I think what some of this power of this Black Madonna material is being able to face that unacceptable part and thereby transform oneself and hopefully the world. That's what I think it really is about. And anyway, I don't know, that's what I'm working on exploring. I think that today is the day that she is revealed. Once a year, they lift the veils, and I think it's today. So we can honor her, La Madonna delle Sette Vele. Well, about a week before I was to come to this conference, I had this dream, which was very brief. All there was to the dream was that I was going to a Black Madonna event and that I was to bring white. And I woke up and thought, white? I mean, we're supposed to be honoring the black. Why white? And because I've been involved with Jungian things, I did immediately think, well, that balances things out. I mean, if you're doing a drawing, which I draw, that there's a wonderful thing with positive and negative. There's the white paper against the black ink, or you can think about it with the yin-yang symbol, where there's the masculine and the feminine, and it's balanced. So that I thought, well, that's true that white balances black, but why am I to bring white to this thing? I still wasn't really clear, and I thought, well, you know, am I supposed to wear white? Well, I didn't think that was it. And I thought, well, what do I even have that's white? I mean, and then, you know, a couple of days went by and it just was in the back of my mind, but I didn't really. And I was looking in the mirror, which is over, it's actually a mirror I got in Mexico, which is over this little sort of altar area where I have put things that, and I change it around. And so I have different objects there. And I suddenly caught that, in fact, I did have two white objects on this, in this space. And one of them was a sand dollar, a white sand dollar, which I'd hung right under the mirror and behind this lovely little statue to it's a sculpture of the Madonna holding a child, done in green, actually, like the green Tara, but that was given to me by a woman who was a real mentor of mine. So anyway, and I had liked it. The sand dollar was given to me by my little girl, and I'd liked it because it was from the sea, you know, and I'd hung it there without, and also because it was a mandala, and I'm very involved with mandalas, and I think mandalas are very related to this subject, which may be a whole nother topic. But anyway, I have a large collection of children's mandalas because I work with children in art. And then the other white thing that was on this space was this kind of bone-shaped little piece of little sculpture that a woman had given me recently at a dinner party, a Japanese woman who's a sculptor, and she made these kind of odd shapes, and she gave each of us one, and they all look like different shaped little bones. And when I like the feel of it in my hand a lot, and I guess I put it on this little altar area because it sort of reminded me of the ancient vulture goddess, you know, and how bones used to be honored. And so I just put it there without thinking very much about it or putting much import into either of these objects. But, you know, now that I was meant to bring white, I thought, well, at least I have these, if nothing else. So I packed them up, and but I still wasn't very clear about why I was bringing them. The sea seemed important and the bones, but I brought them because I didn't know what else to bring, and I knew that I should some way honor whatever this dream was about. And after I was here, though, for a few days, there was a lot of talk about the fact that we were white women here, and we're talking about the Dark Mother, and we have no, you know, no Latinos, no Native Americans, no, there was very few. In other words, how unfortunate it was that there weren't people of color. We had no black women in this conference with us, and I felt that too, and I felt that it was really important to encourage this to become more of a multiracial endeavor. And we were talking about it, and I noticed that some of us, myself included, started trying to identify with peoples of color in this, and I started talking, and Lucia got very excited about the fact that we'd both come across this work by a man named Cavalli Sforza, who is a geneticist working at Stanford, who has traced the migrations of peoples through DNA. This is quite a modern process, and has, according to his findings, discovered that, which sound very interesting, that the original migrations all came out of Africa. Following that Cavalli Sforza's findings, he discovered that the original migrations started from Africa and covered the whole globe. The next migrations came from Asia, and that the people that are so-called white people are in actual fact made up, according to the makeup of the DNA, are in fact 65% Asian and 35% African. So in other words, that to be a different race becomes irrelevant, actually, according to this theory. But I sort of sensed a bunch of us trying to identify and say, well, we have traces of this dark blood somewhere, you know, and I started realizing the absurdity of this. I mean, because in our culture, many of the people who were present at the conference are considered white people. okay? And we're not white. I mean, we're not white like paper any more than black people are black like ink. But, and we all have this common DNA, but there was a certain sense of guilt about the fact that we were white people talking about the Dark Mother. And I began to think about how this isn't going to help. Holding this guilt isn't going to help. It's not going to help make a bridge between the races. It's going to cause an obstacle instead. If we take on the guilt of all the atrocities white people have perpetuated, which God knows they have, to take it on personally isn't going to help create a bridge between the races. And in fact, white people don't have any patent on doing atrocities. I mean, savagery. There's no patent on this thing. I mean, this has happened amongst all races, unfortunately. And it's the Dark Mother, recognizing the dark in all of us that might help remedy this, but not through assuming the guilt of what has happened. We need to come to this material from within ourselves and go outward. So I began thinking, well, you know, I was meant to bring white because we need to address this question of the fact that we are considered white in our culture, and realizing that we need to honor who we are, whoever we are, whatever race, that the Black Madonna accepts us all, regardless of what size we are, how old we are, what infirmities we have, what failings we have, and certainly accepts us all regardless of whatever the hue of our skin. And that we need to celebrate all of us, including whoever, you know, whatever hue our skin is. And that would be her message. And then I looked again at these objects that I had brought, and I thought about the sand dollar, and I realized that, in fact, no matter how you trace DNA, we are all of us from the sea, all of us. And so we can all be accepted equally. And so that's why I had brought this thing from the sea. And then I looked at the bone thing and thought, well, you know, when we die, we are all reduced to the most permanent thing is this white bone. And that used to be very honored in the ancient traditions, the whiteness of death. And the bone was also a great mystery. And so that was something that, and then I began to understand why it was I was supposed to bring white. And at the same time, feeling that it would be extraordinary if the Black Madonna interest and could help truly create bridges between people of different colors. And come to something that we all need. There's one other thing I want to say, and that only happened recently too, and that I've only come to understand within the last few days, and that is that I actually I went to see in May a woman who was a maid in our household from the time I was 4 until I was 24, who is black and whose name is, guess what? Mary. And I went to see Mary in May. She's now 84 years old. She's working part-time at an institution for mentally handicapped people, and she's strong. And it was a very moving experience to see her again, and she immediately introduced me to all of her friends as her youngest daughter, which was really lovely. And And she started telling me about her life and things that she didn't tell me when I was a child for a very good reason. But she was a severely, severely abused child. She grew up in North Carolina on a tenant farm, and her mother died when she was 4, and her father remarried, and it was a real archetypal stepmother situation, and she was beaten, tied to the bed and beaten to the point where she could hardly see. She said she would come out, she remembers being only able to see pink color. In other words, she was really severely abused. Then her father left, and he was a lout also, but luckily she had older brothers and sisters. She had a 17-year-old brother and a 15-year-old sister who basically brought her up. And her father was a drunk. He would leave and come back very infrequently and take whatever it was that they had managed to put together on this through farming. And so he would show up and take the money that they had made. And so that's the parenting that she had. And she was actually suffered some brain damage, I guess, from all the beating. So she came to work for my family when she must have been, I figured out, 30-something. And she couldn't read or write. She had never been to school. And I didn't know this, but one of the things that moved me tremendously in seeing her was she told me that after we went to bed, because I had an older brother and sister, she would study our school books, and she learned how to read and write, and has written me. I should have brought this letter that she wrote, this extraordinary letter. But so this has been another refining of a true mother that's mine, who is black. And she did supply it, because I certainly, in many ways, had wonderful parents, but there were some severe lacks in terms of emotional needs. And Mary was not able to completely supply them, having had the parenting that she had, but she did pretty well considering her start in life. And so I have had a kind of wonderful connection there. And then also realizing what she had come from and the kind of dignity that she maintained in spite of the lacks that she had experienced.